Welcome to the presentation for Chapter 5, which is about proteins. In this presentation, we'll review what proteins are, their functions in the body, how much protein athletes should consume, and what types of proteins to consume before, during, and after exercise. So if you're an athlete or just one to hit the gym a few times a week, you've likely been faced with a lot of conflicting information about protein. This ranges from the myth that you cannot ingest too much protein to the myth that everyone should take a protein supplement. And unless you're reading peer-reviewed journal articles on the topic of protein use in athletics, you're likely getting most of your protein information from your friends, your coaches, and or your trainers or advertisements. The information within this chapter should help you to dispel many of these myths. Let's go back to the basics and review proteins before we move on to how they relate to athletes and performance. Now remember that proteins are complex organic molecules that are chemically similar to carbohydrates and fats because they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. What makes them stand apart from carbs and fats is that proteins also contain nitrogen, which is important in the production of enzymes and hormones. Proteins are made up of smaller chemical units called amino acids. Each amino acid is composed of a carbon atom bound to a hydrogen atom, and you can see a diagram on the right side of this, in three different groups of atoms. Let's revisit the anatomy of an amino acid. The amino acid's anchor is the central carbon atom, and attached to it is the amino group or nitrogen-containing group, a carboxylic acid group, and a carbon side chain. The sequence of amino acids and the side chain characteristics of those amino acids determines each protein's unique three-dimensional structure and function. Proteins are composed of chains of hundreds, even thousands of amino acids held together by peptide bonds. These are chemical bonds formed between two amino acids when the carboxyl group of one amino acid reacts with the amino group of another amino acid. In the process of forming the peptide bond, water is released, and you can see that on the right-hand side of this slide. This is known as a condensation reaction. Conversely, if one takes in a large amount of protein on a regular basis, the body must break down peptide bonds through hydrolysis reactions, or reactions that require water. Those who consume a high-protein diet may be at a higher risk of dehydration due to these hydrolysis reactions. So, although it's rare to have negative effects from protein intake, it is important to ensure that an athlete is not over-consuming this particular macronutrient. So you probably remember this from basic nutrition or any other class you've taken that might have touched on proteins, but there are 20 amino acids that are able to be used by our bodies. Some of these amino acids are produced by our bodies and some have to be obtained from food. Now the 9 amino acids that we can't produce in our own bodies are called essential amino acids, and they must be obtained from our diets. One example of an essential amino acid is the one called leucine, which is mainly obtained from animal foods. Therefore, vegetarians and vegans must pay close attention to the quantity and quality of protein consumed. Plant-based protein sources are often incomplete or missing important essential amino acids, usually contain fewer branched-chain amino acids than animal-based protein sources. Now, since leucine appears to be the primary prompt for muscle protein synthesis and plays an important role in recovery from exercise, vegetarian and vegan athletes should focus on foods that contain leucine. For example, soy, quinoa, and even oats. Now, unlike the essential amino acids, non-essential amino acids are those that can be produced by our body and do not require that we consume them from our diet. Now, a trickier concept is that of the conditionally essential amino acid. Conditionally essential amino acids become essential for people because of certain conditions or illnesses. A good example of this is a condition called phenylketonuria or PKU. Those with PKU are born with the inability to break down phenylalanine because of a mutation in the enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase, which under normal circumstances adds an alcohol group to phenylalanine to form tyrosine. Now, since tyrosine cannot be produced by those with PKU, it becomes essential for them, which is why tyrosine is considered a conditionally essential amino acid. Its production is based on whether or not someone has a certain condition such as PKU. In the case of those with PKU, they are usually prescribed a tyrosine supplement since foods high in tyrosine, like chicken, milk, and peanuts, are also high in phenylalanine. Another concept to understand when discussing proteins is the difference between a complete and an incomplete protein. Complete proteins are those that contain all of the essential amino acids in high amounts. These are mostly found in meats, fish, eggs, and dairy products, which is perfectly fine for those of us who eat meat and dairy or can eat it without any type of reaction or allergic reaction. However, what about those athletes who have, for various reasons, chosen to become vegetarian or vegan? Most plant foods are considered incomplete protein sources because they are missing one or more of the essential amino acids. The amino acid that is either missing or in short supply is known as a limiting amino acid. Now, how do vegetarian and vegan athletes such as track star Carl Lewis, tennis phenom Venus Williams, and former heavyweight champion boxer Mike Tyson get enough proteins when they don't consume the foods that are most abundant in complete proteins? These athletes have to compensate for the lack of complete protein sources by consuming complementary protein sources such as beans, legumes, nuts, seeds, whole grains, and soy products, which will provide all essential amino acids if consumed over the course of the day. The old myth that a vegetarian or a vegan can't get enough protein is certainly not true, especially when we see so many successful elite athletes who have committed to these dietary lifestyles. Okay, so now that we've quickly reviewed what proteins are, let's take a look at the functions of proteins and why they are of particular importance to athletes. They're responsible for many functions in the body. They build and maintain body tissues and structures. They're involved in the synthesis of enzymes and hormones and help to build new tissue. For example, when we're trying to build muscle mass. Now, the athlete uneducated on how protein works may think that when you eat a piece of steak, the protein in that steak goes directly to the biceps, and this is not the way protein works. Unlike carbs, our bodies don't have a holding tank for protein, where it can take from the reserves when we need it, which is why we need to eat protein each day throughout the day. Now, protein is broken down by the body into amino acids, where it goes to our fat tissue to be converted to triglycerides. The breakdown products of protein can also be converted into glucose and used for fuel if necessary when the body is in a fasting state or not getting enough calories from carbohydrates or fats. This is not the typical use of protein, however, since the body prefers carbs as its primary source of energy and prefers to use protein to build and maintain the tissues of the body. This is, of course, an oversimplified explanation of what happens when we consume protein, but since this is probably a review for you, I wasn't going to spend too much more time on it. Now, how do we know if we're getting enough protein in our diets? This can be done through the measurement of something called nitrogen balance. Recall that proteins, unlike carbs and fats, contain nitrogen, like I mentioned at the start of this, which is why we can use a measure of nitrogen in the body to determine if you're getting enough protein. The concept of nitrogen balance is an indicator of your nitrogen status and thus protein intake. It is simply the measure of nitrogen output subtracted from nitrogen input. The nitrogen in is your daily protein intake from your food or through protein supplements, and the nitrogen out is loss of nitrogen in urea, which can be excreted in urine and sweat. So if someone is taking in less nitrogen than they are excreting, they are said to be in a negative nitrogen balance. And conversely, if they're taking in more than they are excreting, they're said to be in a positive nitrogen balance. Now, lean tissue is formed when an athlete is in positive balance, and tissue is metabolized or broken down when in negative balance. So obviously, an athlete would want to avoid being in negative nitrogen balance. Measuring nitrogen balance is not really something you could do on your own because you would need trained personnel and special lab equipment to do this. So it's not something the average athlete probably would know unless you had special tests performed. So if you want to at least maintain your nitrogen balance or be in a positive energy balance for building lean muscle tissue, how can an athlete determine how much you need? There's not a one-size-fits-all diet, as we know, for athletes, and this philosophy is the same for protein intake. There are many factors that influence an athlete's protein needs, but the most reliable way is to calculate requirements based on your current body weight. Now, the recommended dietary allowance, or RDA, for the general public is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight for a daily total percent of calories of 10 to 35%. Now, it's recommended that athletes take in a little bit more protein than non-athletes, and the recommended range for daily protein is 1.2 to 2.0 grams per kilogram of body weight for a total daily percent of calories of 15 to 35%. Now remember that an athlete should focus on staying in a positive nitrogen balance because chronic protein deficiency will cancel the benefits of your workout. Now, for the sake of time and this presentation going on for a very long time, I would like you to read pages 124 to 126, which discusses the factors influencing protein requirements. If you have any questions, contact me and I'll be happy to discuss these. So the factors are your total energy intake. Now, how much protein you'll want to consume will be based on whether you're trying to lose or gain weight, your carbohydrate availability, how much you exercise and how long, your training state and your fitness level, the dietary protein quality that you're taking in, of course, your age, and whether or not you are injured or rehabilitating. So what are some good protein sources for athletes? Before we discuss this, know that not all food groups are good sources of protein. For instance, as you probably remember, most fruits hardly provide any protein. This is why it's extremely important to vary your protein sources each day over the course of the day. The grains group are considered a moderate source of protein. Grains, remember, are incomplete protein foods because they contain very little lysine, which is also an essential amino acid. Legumes, nuts, and seeds, in addition to whole grains, are the key to balancing amino acid needs. And remember, combined protein sources are also called complementary proteins, since when consumed together, they provide all the essential amino acids. Vegetables also contain minimal protein, while dairy and dairy alternatives are an excellent source of protein. As the name implies, the protein food group, made up of meat, fish, poultry, eggs, and soy, is also an excellent source of protein. But remember to combine the meats, eggs, and poultry with whole grains and dairy to obtain all the amino acids.